The year is 1620. A small ship, the Mayflower, battles the unforgiving waves of the Atlantic, carrying a group of devout, determined individuals towards a new world. They call themselves pilgrims, and they seek freedom from religious persecution, a place where they can worship God according to their own conscience, unfettered by the dictates of the Church of England. Yet, as they cast their gaze upon the unfamiliar shores of what would become New England, they brought with them more than just Bibles, tools, and dreams of a purer society. They carried a deep-seated, pervasive fear, a fear born of centuries of European superstition, theological dogma, and social anxiety. They carried with them the very real, very terrifying belief in witchcraft. This wasn't a whimsical, storybook notion of pointy hats and bubbling cauldrons. For these early American colonists, witchcraft was a palpable, malevolent force, an insidious plot orchestrated by the devil himself. It was a belief so ingrained, so fundamentally woven into the fabric of their worldview, that it would ultimately lead to some of the most shocking and tragic episodes in American history. You might think you know the story of colonial witchcraft, perhaps a simplified version culminating in the infamous Salem witch trials. But I assure you the truth is far more complex, far more chilling, and extends far beyond the well-trodden paths of Salem village. You have been told a story, but perhaps not the whole story. Imagine, if you will, the isolation of these early settlements, sparse communities carved out of a vast, wild, and often terrifying wilderness. The howling winds through dense, unfamiliar forests. The constant threat of disease, famine, and conflict with indigenous populations. Life was a relentless struggle for survival, a brutal test of faith and endurance. In such a precarious existence, where did one turn for explanations when crops failed, livestock sickened, or a child inexplicably wasted away? When scientific understanding was rudimentary, and the hand of God was seen in every sunrise and every storm, what explained inexplicable misfortune? The answer for many was simple, terrifying, and deeply comforting in its own twisted way: the devil. And his earthly agents, the witches. The concept of a witch, someone who had made a pact with the devil to gain supernatural powers, was not an American invention. It was a direct import from Europe, where for centuries, particularly during the early modern period, a chilling witch craze had swept across the continent. From the late 14th century through the 17th century, tens of thousands of individuals, predominantly women, were accused, tortured, and executed for the crime of witchcraft across Europe. England, from which many American colonists hailed, had its own well-established legal framework and popular beliefs concerning witchcraft. The Witchcraft Act of 1604, passed under King James I, himself a fervent believer in and author on demonology, made witchcraft a felony punishable by death. So, when the first settlers landed on American shores, this dark legal and social inheritance came with them, as surely as their tools and their Bibles. The intellectual foundation for this widespread belief was deeply rooted in Christian theology and demonology. Puritan ministers, highly educated and influential figures in colonial society, preached sermons filled with vivid descriptions of Satan's constant machinations. They believed the New World was a wild, untamed frontier, a spiritual battleground where the devil held particular sway, constantly seeking to corrupt and undermine their godly experiment. Every unexplained illness, every sudden death, every strange animal behavior could be interpreted as the devil's handiwork, manifested through a human intermediary, a witch. It's crucial to understand that these accusations were not simply the product of ignorance or malice, though those elements certainly played their part. They were rooted in a deeply held, pervasive worldview where the spiritual realm was undeniably real and constantly interacting with the physical. For the Puritans, there was no neutral ground. One was either with God or with the devil. And the devil, ever cunning, would seek to ensnare even the most pious through subtle temptation or overt malevolence. Witches in this cosmology were not just troublemakers, they were traitors to God, agents of cosmic evil. The first recorded accusation of witchcraft in the British colonies actually predates Salem by decades. In 1626, in Virginia, a woman named Joan Wright was accused. While the outcome of her case is not definitively known, it signals the early presence of these fears. The first recorded execution for witchcraft in the colonies occurred in 1647, when Alce Young was hanged in Windsor, Connecticut. These isolated cases, scattered across various colonies, set a precedent. They established that colonial communities were prepared to take action, and indeed, often swift and brutal action, against those suspected of practicing the dark arts. The legal framework for these trials was often a direct transplant from English common law, albeit interpreted and adapted by colonial magistrates and ministers who, unlike their English counterparts, often lacked formal legal training. The presumption of innocence, a cornerstone of modern justice, was often inverted. The accused were frequently considered guilty until proven innocent, and the burden of proof was shifted. Without a standing legal profession to advocate for the accused, and in a society where public opinion and religious zeal held immense sway, the dice were often heavily loaded against anyone unlucky enough to be singled out. The early cases of witchcraft accusations and trials weren't always as dramatic or as deadly as Salem. Many accusations might have simply resulted in social ostracism, fines, or public shaming. But the underlying fear, the readiness to believe in maleficium, the use of witchcraft to cause harm, was always present. It simmered beneath the surface of colonial life, a silent, menacing current, waiting for the right conditions to erupt into full-blown hysteria. And those conditions, a volatile mix of religious anxiety, social tension, economic hardship, and psychological stress, would eventually converge in a small Massachusetts village, forever etching the name Salem into the grim annals of history. But before we journey to Salem, we must first understand the landscape upon which this tragedy was built. The deeply spiritual, yet profoundly fearful heart of early colonial America. A land where the devil was not just a theological concept, but a very real, very present enemy. To truly grasp the terror that gripped colonial communities, we must understand the precise nature of the fear they held concerning witchcraft. It wasn't merely about someone casting a spell to sour milk or lame a horse, though these petty acts of maleficium were certainly part of the catalog of accusations. The deeper, more profound fear was the belief in a covenant with the devil. This was the ultimate transgression, a spiritual treason against God, and it transformed a petty quarrel into a matter of cosmic significance. The Puritan worldview, rigid and unyielding, posited a universe locked in an eternal struggle between God and Satan. There was no middle ground, no spiritual neutrality. To not be with God was to be against him, and to be against him meant, by extension, to be an agent of the devil. A witch, therefore, was not merely a person who dabbed in forbidden arts. They were a soul irrevocably damned, who had willingly surrendered their immortal spirit to the Prince of Darkness in exchange for worldly power. This was a direct assault on the very foundation of Puritan society, which viewed itself as a shining city upon a hill, a beacon of God's chosen people. The presence of witches within their midst was an unbearable affront, a sign of their own vulnerability to Satan's pervasive influence. The devil, in the Puritan imagination, was no abstract concept. He was a tangible, cunning adversary, constantly prowling, seeking whom he might devour. Ministers preached fiery sermons describing his insidious methods, his tempting whispers, his ability to assume various guises, even appearing as a respectable neighbor or a beloved family member. The devil was seen as having a hierarchy of demons and familiar spirits at his command, all working to undermine God's kingdom on earth. And the witch was the human conduit for this malevolence. What constituted evidence of such a diabolical pact? This is where the interpretation became dangerously subjective and often terrifyingly arbitrary. Maleficium, or harmful acts, were a primary indicator. If a person suffered unexplained illness, a sudden misfortune, or an animal died without apparent cause, suspicion might fall upon a neighbor with whom there had been a recent disagreement or a long-standing feud. A strange mark on the body, interpreted as a witch's mark or devil's mark, where a familiar spirit might supposedly suckle, could also be considered damning evidence. These marks could be anything from moles to scars, easily found on any human body, yet in the climate of fear, they took on sinister significance. Perhaps most chillingly, spectral evidence played a crucial role, particularly in later trials. This referred to the testimony of victims who claimed to have seen the accused specter or spirit tormenting them. This spectral form could pinch, choke, or torment the afflicted, even while the accused's physical body was elsewhere, perhaps even in plain sight. The theological debate over spectral evidence was intense. Could the devil truly assume the form of an innocent person? Or did God only allow him to use the specter of someone who had truly covenanted with him? Puritan ministers largely concluded the latter, opening the door for accusations based solely on subjective, unverifiable visions. If you saw someone's specter tormenting you, then that person, even if physically absent, was undeniably a witch. This concept would prove devastatingly effective in courtrooms. The social dynamics within colonial communities also played a significant role in fostering an environment ripe for accusations. These were tight-knit, often insular villages, where gossip and personal grudges could fester. Economic hardships, land disputes, and social anxieties could easily escalate into accusations. Imagine a community facing a harsh winter, struggling with crop failures, or experiencing an epidemic. In such times of stress, the search for a scapegoat for an explanation could become desperate. Those who were already marginalized, the elderly, the poor, the eccentric, the outspoken, or those who didn't conform to strict Puritan norms, were often the first to be targeted. Women, especially those who were independent, single, or widowed, and who possessed some form of perceived power, often economic or social, were particularly vulnerable. The misogynistic undercurrents of the era certainly contributed to the overwhelming number of female accused. A woman who defied expectations or challenged authority was easily cast as an unruly, perhaps even malevolent, figure. Moreover, the power of confession, often extracted under duress, was immense. In a society so deeply rooted in religious belief, a confession was seen not just as legal proof, but as a spiritual victory, a stripping away of the devil's deception. Accused individuals were pressured, often through prolonged interrogation, isolation, and psychological manipulation, to confess their pact with the devil, to name others who were also involved in this unholy conspiracy. A confession, even if false, could lead to a lighter sentence, though still severe, whereas maintaining innocence in the face of overwhelming circumstantial and spectral evidence often sealed a death sentence. The paradox was cruel. Confess and live, though your reputation would be forever ruined and you would likely be ostracized, or deny and die. The justice system itself was ill-equipped to handle such cases. Colonial courts were often run by local magistrates and laypersons, not formally trained legal professionals. Rules of evidence were fluid, and often hearsay, rumor, and subjective interpretation were given significant weight. The accused rarely had legal representation. The trials were public spectacles, adding another layer of pressure and emotional intensity. The collective fear and fervent belief in the devil's presence could easily sway juries and magistrates, transforming a semblance of justice into a terrifying inquisition. The constant threat of Native American attacks also contributed to the atmosphere of fear and paranoia. Many Puritans viewed the indigenous peoples as savages and heathens, easily influenced by the devil. This added another layer of anxiety, as misfortunes or conflicts on the frontier could be readily attributed to satanic influence, further blurring the lines between natural disaster, human conflict, and supernatural malevolence. It was this potent cocktail of religious conviction, social anxiety, economic pressure, and deep-seated superstition that created a fertile ground for the escalation of witchcraft accusations. When the community believed itself under direct assault by Satan, and when the signs of his presence seemed to manifest in sickness, death, and social discord, the hunt for his human agents became not just a legal necessity, but a holy war. The stage was being set for a wider, more devastating conflagration, one that would consume entire communities and leave an indelible stain on the nascent American consciousness. The belief wasn't just a quaint historical oddity. It was a living, breathing terror that dictated how people lived, feared, and died. While Salem casts a long shadow over the history of colonial witchcraft, it was far from the first or only place where accusations took root. Indeed, the seeds of fear had been sown decades earlier, sporadically sprouting in isolated cases across the fledgling settlements of New England and beyond. These earlier incidents, though often less dramatic and with fewer fatalities than the later conflagration, were crucial. They established precedents, shaped legal interpretations, and gradually normalized the idea that witchcraft was a tangible, punishable offense. They were the first whispers of malice that would eventually grow into a terrifying chorus. Let us return to the earliest documented cases. As mentioned, Alce Young holds the grim distinction of being the first person executed for witchcraft in the American colonies. This occurred on May 26, 1647, in Windsor, Connecticut. We know tragically little about Alce Young beyond this chilling fact. The records are scant, offering no details about the specific accusations against her, the evidence presented, or even her age or background. What we do know is that her execution, an act of such finality, served as a stark warning to others. It sent a clear message throughout the nascent colony. Witchcraft was real, it was dangerous, and its practitioners would face the ultimate penalty. The ground had been broken. The Puritan colonies of New England, particularly Massachusetts Bay and Connecticut, were especially fertile ground for such fears. Their strict Calvinist theology emphasized a constant vigilance against the devil's temptations and a profound belief in divine providence. Every misfortune could be interpreted as God's wrath or, more terrifyingly, Satan's direct intervention. In such a worldview, witches became convenient scapegoats for any ill that befell a community. One of the most notable early clusters of accusations occurred in Springfield, Massachusetts, during the late 1640s and early 1650s, involving the Parsons family. The story begins with a simmering feud between two prominent families, the Parsons and the Mirrors. In 1651, Mary Parsons, a young woman, began exhibiting strange fits and behaviors, claiming to be tormented by evil spirits. Her accusations quickly pointed towards her neighbors, Hugh and Mary Parsons. Hugh was a brickmaker, known for his hot temper and argumentative nature, traits that made him unpopular. Mary, his wife, was described as a gossipy and somewhat contentious woman. These were precisely the kind of individuals who, when misfortune struck, might find themselves under the lens of suspicion. The accusations against Hugh Parsons included bewitching livestock, causing illness, and even tormenting Mary Parsons' specter. What makes this case particularly interesting is that Hugh, in turn, accused his wife Mary of witchcraft, claiming she had bewitched their own child who had died recently. This self-incrimination, likely born of fear and desperation, further muddied the waters. The trials were extensive, involving numerous witnesses, examinations of the accused, and considerable community involvement. Hugh Parsons was eventually acquitted of witchcraft but found guilty of lying, a serious offense in a Puritan community that valued truth and honesty. His wife Mary, however, was found guilty of witchcraft, yet she escaped execution. Her sentence was deferred, and she eventually died in prison, likely before her case could be fully reviewed by the higher court in Boston. The Springfield case illustrates the complexities and ambiguities of these early trials, where accusations could be fluid, motives murky, and outcomes unpredictable, though often tragic. Another significant early case occurred in Hartford, Connecticut, in 1662, centered around the accusation of Rebecca Greensmith. This case escalated into a small witch panic, leading to the execution of 4 people, including Rebecca. Rebecca Greensmith was described as a poor, quarrelsome woman, known for her sharp tongue and eccentric behavior, classic markers that often drew suspicion. Her husband, Nathaniel, was also accused. Rebecca, under intense pressure and interrogation, confessed to meeting with the devil, seeing his black man form and signing his book. She also implicated others, including her husband and Martha Corey, who would later be a victim in Salem. Her confession, though likely coerced, provided powerful validation for the accusers and magistrates, confirming their belief in a local coven of witches. This Hartford Panic of 1662 demonstrates the contagious nature of fear and accusation, how one confession could unravel into multiple accusations, quickly overwhelming a community. These early instances, whether in Windsor, Springfield, or Hartford, reveal several consistent patterns that would sadly be replicated on a larger scale in Salem. Firstly, the accusations often arose from interpersonal conflicts, disputes over property, or long-standing animosities. A neighborly squabble could quickly spiral into a supernatural accusation if one party experienced misfortune. Secondly, the accused often fit a certain social profile. They were frequently older women, economically marginalized, or those who deviated from strict social norms. Their vulnerability made them easy targets. Thirdly, the legal process, even in its earliest forms, struggled to contain the emotional and spiritual fervor surrounding these cases. The reliance on circumstantial evidence, the pressure for confessions, and the belief in spectral torment created a system prone to error and injustice. These scattered trials, while not reaching the catastrophic scale of Salem, kept the belief in active, malevolent witchcraft alive and well in the colonial consciousness. They solidified the legal and social mechanisms for dealing with alleged witches. Each execution, each confession, each public accusation reinforced the terrifying reality of the devil's presence and the constant need for vigilance. The colonists were, in a sense, rehearsing. They were establishing the playbook, the tragic choreography that would be performed with devastating consequences decades later. The very landscape of colonial America also played a psychological role. The dense, foreboding forests, the harsh winters, the constant struggle against nature, and the ever-present threat of disease created an environment of heightened anxiety and isolation. In such a world, where the boundaries between the known and unknown were perpetually blurred, it was easy for the mind to conjure unseen forces, for the unexplained to be attributed to the supernatural. The devil was not just a figure in a sermon. He lurked in the shadows of the wilderness, ready to ensnare souls, manifesting his power through human agents. So by the time the fateful events of 1692 began to unfold in a small, quarrelsome village named Salem, the fear of witchcraft was not a new or surprising phenomenon. It was an established reality, a threat that had been acknowledged, fought, and seemingly defeated in smaller skirmishes across the colonies for decades. The stage was set, the characters were known, and the dark curtain was slowly beginning to rise on the most infamous act of this chilling American drama. The shocking truth is that Salem was not an anomaly, but rather the culmination of a long, terrifying historical thread. The year is 1692. The location: Salem Village, a small, contentious farming community nestled a few miles inland from the bustling port town of Salem Town in the Massachusetts Bay Colony. Salem Village was a place rife with internal tensions. There were long-standing disputes over land boundaries, economic grievances between the more prosperous residents near Salem Town and the struggling farmers of the village, and deep-seated personal feuds that had simmered for years, even generations. Most importantly, there was a bitter ecclesiastical struggle centered around their minister, Reverend Samuel Parris. Reverend Parris was a man of stern Puritan convictions, but also prone to self-pity and contention. He had served as a merchant in Barbados before coming to the ministry, and he brought with him two enslaved people: Tituba, a woman of indeterminate Caribbean or Native American background, and her husband, John Indian. Parris's ministry in Salem Village was troubled from the start. He was constantly embroiled in disputes over his salary, his parsonage, and the overall governance of the church. The community was fractured, divided into factions for and against Parris, creating an atmosphere of suspicion and resentment. This pre-existing landscape of discord would prove to be fertile ground for the seeds of fear and paranoia to take root and blossom into something truly terrifying. The conventional narrative often begins in the winter of 1691-1692, within the Parris household itself. Reverend Parris's 9-year-old daughter, Betty, and his 11-year-old niece, Abigail Williams, began to exhibit peculiar behaviors. They suffered from what was described as fits, uncontrollable screaming, violent contortions of their bodies, barking like dogs, and complaining of being pinched and pricked by unseen forces. They would reportedly go deaf and mute for periods, throw objects, and speak in strange tongues. These were not behaviors easily explained by the medical understanding of the time. To the deeply religious Puritans, such inexplicable afflictions could only have one source: the devil, and the devil, they believed, worked through human agents. The village doctor, William Griggs, was called to examine the girls. After exhausting all medical explanations known to him, he offered the chilling diagnosis that the girls were under an evil hand. This pronouncement, coming from a man of science, as much as science existed then, lent significant weight to the growing suspicions of witchcraft. The community's fear transformed into a desperate search for answers, for the identity of the tormentors. Under intense pressure from their families and ministers, and perhaps genuinely believing themselves tormented, Betty Parris and Abigail Williams began to name names. The initial accusations were leveled against three marginalized women in the community. The first was Tituba, Reverend Parris's enslaved woman. Her foreign origin, her knowledge of Caribbean folklore and possibly voodoo traditions, though this is debated by historians, and her status as an enslaved person made her an immediate outsider and an easy target. She had reportedly been entertaining the girls with stories of magic and fortune-telling, which, while perhaps innocent storytelling to her, was seen as deeply transgressive by Puritan standards. The second accused was Sarah Good. She was a homeless beggar, known for smoking a pipe, muttering to herself, and generally being an unpleasant, socially defiant individual. She had lost property and was in debt, and her independent and often bitter demeanor made her an outcast. Her young child, Dorcas, was also eventually accused. The third was Sarah Osborne. She was an elderly, often bedridden woman who had raised community eyebrows by marrying her indentured servant and attempting to reclaim land from her adult sons. She was also accused of not attending church services regularly, a serious breach of Puritan social norms. Her ill health and social isolation made her another vulnerable target. These three women represented the archetypes of vulnerability in Puritan society: an enslaved person, a beggar, and a nonconformist. They had little social standing, few connections, and no powerful allies to defend them. Their arrests and initial examinations in late February and early March of 1692 marked the official beginning of the Salem witch trials. The examinations were not trials in the modern sense. They were preliminary hearings, designed to elicit confessions and gather evidence for a formal trial. They took place in public, often in the meeting house, before magistrates like Jonathan Corwin and John Hathorne, an ancestor of Nathaniel Hawthorne, who later added the W to his name to distance himself from his notorious ancestor. The afflicted girls were present, often falling into fits at the sight of the accused, pointing, screaming, and dramatically reacting to the supposed torment of the witch's specters. This spectral evidence, the testimony of the afflicted that they saw the accused spirit tormenting them, quickly became the most compelling and most dangerous form of evidence. Under intense questioning and likely facing severe pressure and possibly even physical abuse, Tituba did what was, in retrospect, a desperate act of survival. She confessed, but her confession was not just a simple admission of guilt. It was a vivid, dramatic, and terrifying narrative of consorting with the devil. She spoke of a tall, black man who approached her, coaxing her to sign his book. She described seeing spectral images of other people, familiar faces from the village, also signing the devil's book. She spoke of riding through the air on a stick, of meeting with animal familiars, and of plotting to harm the children. Tituba's confession was a turning point. It validated the fears of the community and the magistrates. It confirmed their belief that a coven of witches was indeed operating within Salem village. Crucially, by naming other individuals even spectrally, she opened the floodgates for further accusations. Her confession, likely a blend of genuine fear, cultural beliefs about magic she may have brought from Barbados, and clever storytelling to save herself, provided the blueprint for future accusations and confessions. It established the narrative. The devil was active, he had human agents, and those agents were among them, signing his book and tormenting the innocent. Sarah Good and Sarah Osborne, in contrast, consistently maintained their innocence, denying any connection to the devil or witchcraft. Their steadfast denials, however, were interpreted not as proof of their innocence, but as further evidence of their guilt. A true witch, it was believed, would be too deeply entrenched in the devil's deception to confess. Their defiance sealed their fate in the eyes of the fearful community and the magistrates. The initial wave of accusations was just the beginning. The fits of the afflicted girls, far from subsiding, seemed to intensify. And as more people were named, the circle of fear began to expand, encompassing not just the marginalized, but respected members of the community, even ministers and their wives. The spark in Salem village had found dry tinder, and the flames of suspicion were beginning to spread rapidly, threatening to consume everything in their path. The horrifying truth was beginning to unfold. Once the idea of a hidden conspiracy of evil took hold, no one was truly safe. Tituba's confession, as we discussed, was the explosive catalyst. Her dramatic tales of spectral meetings and diabolical pacts validated the magistrate's fears and provided a template for the accelerating hysteria. With the evidence of a conspiracy confirmed, the afflicted girls, Betty Paris, Abigail Williams, and soon others like Ann Putnam Jr., Mercy Lewis, Mary Walcott, and Elizabeth Hubbard, became the central figures in the unfolding drama. They were the victims, the channels through which the insidious plot of the devil was revealed. Their fits and torment, witnessed by the community, served as irrefutable proof to many that the devil was indeed at work in Salem village, and that his agents were numerous and hidden. The dynamic became terrifyingly predictable. An afflicted person would suffer a fit, perhaps scream out a name, or claim to see the specter of someone tormenting them. This accusation, no matter how flimsy or bizarre, was often enough to warrant an arrest and a public examination. The examinations themselves became a perverse form of theater. The accused would be brought before the magistrates, and the afflicted would immediately fall into paroxysms of screaming, writhing, and barking. If the accused so much as shifted their weight, or looked at the afflicted would react dramatically, collapsing or screaming that they were being pinched or choked. It was a vicious cycle. The more the afflicted reacted, the more proof there was of the accused's guilt. The accused naturally were put in an impossible position. Any attempt to deny, to defend themselves, or even just to remain stoic was interpreted as the devil empowering them. As the accusations mounted, they began to move beyond the marginalized. The circle widened, snaring individuals who were more respected, more integrated into the community. This escalation lent a terrifying legitimacy to the proceedings. If even good, pious people could be accused, then truly, no one was safe. One of the first and most significant of these new accusations was against Martha Corey. Martha was a respected, even pious member of the Salem village church, known for her sharp wit and independent spirit. She had initially expressed skepticism about the girls' claims, stating that they were poor, distracted children. Her skepticism, however, was immediately interpreted as a sign of her own guilt. Why would she doubt the devil's work unless she was involved in it? Her independent nature and questioning attitude, which in other times might have been seen as strength, now became her undoing. When she was brought for examination, the afflicted girls immediately fell into fits, claiming her specter tormented them. Her steadfast refusal to confess, her insistence on her innocence, was taken as further proof of her deep immersion in the devil's plot. She would ultimately be hanged. Then came the accusation of Rebecca Nurse. If Martha Corey's accusation was shocking, Rebecca Nurse's was utterly seismic. Rebecca was a 71-year-old, ailing, deaf woman, highly respected throughout the community for her piety and good character. She was known to be a woman of exemplary life and virtuous conversation. 39 of her neighbors signed a petition attesting to her good character. Her family was well established and influential. Her initial examination was marked by the overwhelming support of her community. Even the magistrates seemed hesitant to condemn her. Yet, the spectral torments of the afflicted girls were relentless. They screamed that her specter was pinching them, that she was attacking them, that she was trying to force them to sign the devil's book. Despite her age and frailty, and the testimonials of her neighbors, the sheer volume and ferocity of the girls' fits, combined with the prevailing belief in spectral evidence, eventually swayed the court. Even when the jury initially returned a verdict of not guilty, the afflicted girls erupted into such violent fits, and the public outcry was so intense that the court sent the jury back to reconsider. Under immense pressure, the jury reversed its decision, and Rebecca Nurse, a pillar of the community, was condemned to hang. Her case sent a chilling message. No one, regardless of their reputation or piety, was immune. The fear, once unleashed, spread like wildfire, encouraged by a combination of factors. The growing number of afflicted individuals, seemingly genuinely suffering, provided a constant source of new accusations. The magistrates, earnest in their belief that they were rooting out a real satanic conspiracy, pressed for confessions and encouraged the naming of accomplices. Moreover, personal grudges and long-standing feuds found a terrifying new outlet. Neighbors could settle scores, acquire land, or gain social advantage by leveling accusations of witchcraft. The system was now a weapon, wielded by fear and malice alike. The contagion of fear also traveled between towns. Accusations began to surface not just in Salem Village and Salem Town, but in Andover, Ipswich, Topsfield, and other surrounding communities. The afflicted girls from Salem were often transported to these other towns to identify witches there, bringing their dramatic performances and terrifying pronouncements with them. This traveling affliction ensured that the panic was not contained. As the body count of accused rose, so did the desperation of the accused. Some, seeing no other way out, began to confess, often fabricating elaborate stories of meetings with the devil and the attendance of others at witch meetings. These confessions, even if false, were seen as divine victories, proof that the devil's plot was being uncovered. They also served to further validate the spectral evidence and the overall legitimacy of the trials. Each confession, however coerced, added another layer of grim authenticity to the unfolding nightmare. And each confession typically implicated others, expanding the web of accusation even further. The jails filled rapidly. Men, women, and even children as young as 4 years old, like Dorcas Good, Sarah Good's daughter, were arrested, often kept in deplorable conditions, chained and malnourished. The colonial legal system was simply overwhelmed. The sheer volume of cases, combined with the lack of clear legal precedent for such a widespread witch hunt, created chaos. The shocking truth that began to emerge was not just that individuals were being accused, but that the entire community was being consumed by a collective delusion, a moral panic that blinded otherwise rational people to the basic principles of justice and human compassion. The initial spark had become a roaring inferno, and the web of accusation once cast seemed to ensnare anyone who dared to question it, or simply anyone who had an enemy. The foundations of reason were crumbling under the weight of fear and fanaticism. As the jails of Massachusetts Bay Colony swelled with accused witches, the colonial government found itself in an unprecedented crisis. The existing local magistrate system was utterly overwhelmed by the sheer volume of cases, and the public outcry for definitive action mounted. The colony's charter had been revoked in 1684, leaving a legal vacuum, and Governor Sir William Phips, upon his return to Massachusetts in May 1692, found himself confronting a burgeoning panic that threatened to tear the social fabric apart. To address the crisis, Phips established a special court to hear the witchcraft cases, the Court of Oyer and Terminer. The name itself, derived from Norman French, translates roughly to hear and to determine. This court was convened specifically for the purpose of trying the accused witches, and its very establishment signaled the colonial authorities' commitment to prosecuting these cases with utmost seriousness. The court was composed of some of the colony's most prominent figures, including Deputy Governor William Stoughton, who served as the Chief Justice. Stoughton was a staunch Puritan and a firm believer in the reality of witchcraft and the devil's active presence in the world. His theological conviction deeply influenced the court's proceedings and its rulings. Other notable judges included Samuel Sewall, whose later public apology for his role in the trials stands as a rare act of contrition. The Court of Oyer and Terminer convened for its first session in Salem town on June 2, 1692. Their initial task was to establish the rules of evidence and procedure for these unprecedented trials. This is where the true tragedy of the legal process unfolded, for the court's acceptance of certain types of evidence proved to be the ultimate undoing of justice. The most controversial and ultimately deadly form of evidence accepted was spectral evidence. As we discussed, this was the testimony of the afflicted individuals who claimed to have seen the accused spirit tormenting them. The court, guided by Chief Justice Stoughton and the prevailing theological interpretations, believed that the devil could not use the specter of an innocent person to torment, only that of someone who had truly made a pact with him. Therefore, if the afflicted claimed to be tormented by an accused person's specter, it was taken as undeniable proof of that person's guilt. This was a critical misstep, as it allowed subjective, unverifiable and easily manipulated testimony to become the primary basis for conviction. Imagine the scene in the courtroom. The accused stands before the judges, often frail, exhausted, and terrified. The afflicted individuals, many of them young women and girls, are present, often seated in prominent positions. As the accused is questioned, or sometimes merely as they enter the room, the afflicted would erupt into dramatic fits, screaming, writhing, contorting their bodies, claiming to be bitten, pinched, or choked by the accused's invisible specter. If the accused folded their arms, the afflicted would claim their specters were binding them. If the accused gnawed their lip in distress, the afflicted would claim their specters were biting them. It was a harrowing performance, a chilling feedback loop where the accuser's performances seemed to confirm the accused's guilt, and the court, earnest in its pursuit of the devil, interpreted these reactions as irrefutable proof. Other forms of evidence were also admitted. Confessions. As we've seen, these were often coerced through intense interrogation, sleep deprivation, and psychological pressure. Once a confession was given, it was considered powerful evidence, not only against the confessor but also against anyone they might have implicated. Witches' marks, devil's marks. Physical examinations of the accused for any unusual bodily marks, moles, warts, scars, or even birthmarks were conducted. These were interpreted as places where familiar spirits might suckle blood, sealing the pact with the devil. The witch hunters often had no medical training, and their interpretations were arbitrary and prejudiced. Testimony of familiars. Accounts of seeing familiar spirits, often in animal form, like cats, dogs, or birds, associated with the accused were also presented as evidence. Touch test. A perverse test where an accused witch would be made to touch one of the afflicted during a fit. If the fit subsided upon the touch, it was considered proof that the witch's power had passed into the accused, causing the fit to cease. The burden of proof was effectively inverted. Instead of the prosecution having to prove guilt beyond a reasonable doubt, the accused often found themselves in a position where they had to prove their innocence in the face of irrefutable spectral evidence and the fervent beliefs of the court. Legal representation for the accused was virtually non-existent. The trials were swift, often lasting only a day or two, and the accused were given little opportunity to mount a credible defense. The first person tried by the Court of Oyer and Terminer was Bridget Bishop, a woman who had been accused of witchcraft before, known for her independent spirit and unconventional lifestyle. Bishop maintained her innocence vehemently, but the testimony of the afflicted, the discovery of witches' marks on her body, and various accusations of maleficium sealed her fate. She was found guilty, and on June 10, 1692, Bridget Bishop became the first person executed by hanging during the Salem witch trials. Her death marked a grim milestone, signaling the court's readiness to apply the ultimate penalty. The executions quickly followed, often in batches. The court, convinced of the devil's widespread conspiracy, pressed forward, convinced they were doing God's work. They believed they were purifying the colony, stamping out the very root of evil. The initial caution that some judges might have harbored evaporated in the face of what they perceived as overwhelming evidence and the undeniable torments of the afflicted. It is a chilling testament to the power of collective delusion and the fragility of justice in the face of widespread fear. The establishment of the Court of Oyer and Terminer, meant to bring order and justice to the chaos, instead became the primary engine of the tragedy. Its acceptance of spectral evidence, its reliance on coerced confessions, and its unyielding belief in the satanic conspiracy transformed a legal process into a fatal inquisition, ensuring that the number of accused and condemned would only continue to rise. The shocking truth is that the very institution meant to protect the innocent became an instrument of their destruction. With the Court of Oyer and Terminer firmly established, and Chief Justice Stoughton leading with unwavering conviction. The summer of 1692 became a season of unparalleled terror for Massachusetts Bay Colony. The legal machinery, fueled by spectral accusations and coerced confessions, began to grind with horrifying efficiency, producing a grim harvest of convictions and executions. The belief in a widespread satanic conspiracy had taken root, and the court, alongside much of the panicked populace, saw themselves as righteous warriors against the forces of evil. Following the execution of Bridget Bishop on June 10th, the pace of trials and condemnations quickened dramatically. July saw the first mass hangings. On July 19th, 5 more individuals were led to Gallows Hill, a barren knoll overlooking Salem town, and summarily hanged. These included Rebecca Nurse, as discussed, a highly respected elderly woman whose conviction, despite widespread support, sent shockwaves through the community, proving that no one was truly safe. Sarah Good, the beggar woman who famously defied her accusers to the very end. Legend has it that as Reverend Nicholas Noyes urged her to confess on the gallows, she retorted, "You are a liar. I am no more a witch than you are a wizard, and if you take away my life, God will give you blood to drink." Susanna Martin, an outspoken and independent woman from Andover who had been accused of witchcraft before and had a reputation for eccentricity. Elizabeth Howe, another well-regarded woman from Ipswich whose family had been involved in local disputes. Sarah Wilds, from Topsfield, accused along with her husband and stepson. These 5 hangings solidified the court's unwavering commitment. The public spectacle of these executions, meant to deter further witchcraft, instead seemed to deepen the pervasive fear and validate the accusations in the minds of many. The afflicted continued their dramatic performances, and new accusations continued to pour forth. August brought another, even larger, wave of executions. On August 19th, 5 men were hanged, a significant detail as men were less frequently accused in European witch trials. This highlights the unique trajectory of the Salem Panic, where gender did not offer absolute protection. These men were George Burroughs, perhaps the most significant victim of this batch. Burroughs was a former minister of Salem Village, a man of education and standing. His accusation was particularly shocking and seemed to confirm the fears of a high-level satanic plot, as it suggested the devil was even recruiting ministers. He famously recited the Lord's Prayer perfectly on the gallows, a feat believed to be impossible for a witch. Some spectators were so moved that they began to murmur doubts, but Chief Justice Stoughton quickly intervened, reminding them that the devil could transform himself into an angel of light, and that Burroughs' seemingly pious act was merely another diabolical deception. This moment vividly illustrates the court's profound, almost impenetrable, conviction. John Willard, a former constable who had grown disillusioned with the trials and refused to make further arrests, leading to his own accusation. His skepticism was interpreted as proof of his guilt. George Jacobs S.R., an elderly man who steadfastly denied his involvement, even when tortured by the touch test, and confronted with the testimony of his granddaughter, who had confessed and implicated him. John Proctor, a prosperous farmer who was an early and vocal critic of the spectral evidence and the proceedings. He openly questioned the integrity of the afflicted girls, seeing them as frauds. His outspokenness directly led to his own accusation and conviction. His wife, Elizabeth Proctor, was also accused and convicted, but her execution was delayed because she was pregnant. Martha Corey, who we discussed previously, a respected church member whose initial skepticism had marked her for accusation. The case of John Proctor is particularly poignant. His staunch defense of his wife and his open condemnation of the trials as a delusion made him a dangerous adversary in the eyes of the court and the afflicted. He tried to appeal to the higher authorities in Boston, writing letters exposing the flaws in the spectral evidence and the coerced confessions. His efforts, however, were futile and only sealed his own doom. His execution, alongside the respected Reverend Burroughs, demonstrated the trial's indiscriminate nature, consuming anyone, regardless of status or piety, who fell within its ever-widening net. September brought even more victims. On September 19th, Giles Corey, Martha Corey's husband, faced a unique and agonizing fate. As an elderly, independent farmer, he, like his wife, had expressed skepticism about the girl's claims. When accused of witchcraft, he refused to enter a plea of guilty or not guilty. This refusal to plead, known as standing mute, meant that he could not be legally tried. The law at the time prescribed a brutal form of torture, peine forte et dure, to compel a plea. Corey was pressed to death under heavy stones for 2 days, consistently refusing to speak, simply uttering, "More weight." Legend holds that he did this to prevent his farm from being confiscated, ensuring it would pass to his heirs rather than to the colonial authorities. His death was a horrifying testament to the extreme measures taken by the court and the unyielding will of some of the accused. Just 3 days later, on September 22nd, another 8 individuals were hanged on Gallows Hill, the largest single execution day of the trials. Martha Corey, the other one from the August batch, just to be clear, making her the unfortunate one to be in this list too. Mary Easty, Rebecca Nurse's sister, also a woman of excellent reputation who steadfastly proclaimed her innocence in a moving petition to the court. Alice Parker, Ann Pudeator, Wilmot Red, known as Mammy Red, a poor elderly woman from Marblehead, Margaret Scott from Rowley, Samuel Wardwell S.R., from Andover, who initially confessed under duress but later recanted. Mary Parker, also from Andover. By the end of September 1692, the toll was staggering. 19 people had been hanged on Gallows Hill, 1 man, Giles Corey, pressed to death, and several others had died in prison while awaiting trial. The majority were women, but men were increasingly represented, shattering the old patterns of European witch hunts. The entire episode was a whirlwind of accusation, examination, confession, and execution, spiraling seemingly out of control. The grim harvest of that summer was a direct consequence of the court's unyielding belief in the validity of spectral evidence and the desperate drive to purge the colony of Satan's influence. It illustrates how swiftly a society, when gripped by fear and operating under a deeply entrenched belief system, can abandon its own principles of justice and humanity. The shocking truth is that, for many weeks, the courts of Massachusetts were not seeking justice as we understand it, but rather the eradication of what they sincerely believed to be a very real, very present evil. And in that fervent pursuit, they destroyed innocent lives. The relentless march of accusations and executions throughout the summer of 1692 could not continue indefinitely without generating dissent. While the initial fear and religious zeal had provided powerful momentum, the sheer scale of the panic, the growing number of respected citizens being accused, and the increasing absurdity of some of the evidence began to create cracks in the seemingly monolithic facade of belief. Slowly, painfully, doubts began to surface. One of the most significant factors contributing to the shift was the accusation of individuals with undeniable social standing and piety. When people like Rebecca Nurse and Martha Corey, pillars of their communities, were condemned, it became harder for even staunch believers to reconcile the charges with their personal knowledge of the accused. The execution of Reverend George Burroughs, a Harvard-educated minister, was particularly disturbing to many. If even a man of God could be so easily ensnared, who then was truly safe? This indiscriminate nature of the accusations began to erode public trust and sow seeds of doubt amongst those who had initially supported the trials. Furthermore, the afflicted girls, who had been the central figures in the drama, began to lose some credibility as their accusations became increasingly outlandish. They started naming individuals who were clearly beyond reproach, figures like Lady Mary Phipps, the wife of Governor William Phipps, and even the respected minister Cotton Mather's own mother-in-law. When the accusations reached such high echelons of society, it became increasingly difficult for the authorities to maintain the narrative of a genuine satanic conspiracy. The idea that the devil could corrupt anyone was one thing, but that he would target the colony's most prominent and pious figures stretched credulity for some. The nature of spectral evidence itself came under increasing scrutiny. While initially accepted by Chief Justice Stoughton and the Court of Oyer and Terminer, prominent ministers and legal minds began to question its validity. The most influential voice in this debate was that of Increase Mather, the highly respected president of Harvard College and father of Cotton Mather. Increase Mather was a deeply pious man who firmly believed in the reality of witchcraft, having written a treatise on the subject years earlier. However, he also believed in strict legal standards and due process. In October 1692, Increase Mather delivered a sermon and later published a crucial treatise titled Cases of Conscience concerning evil spirits personating men. In this work, he argued forcefully against the reliability of spectral evidence. His central argument was a theological one. Could the devil, by God's permission, assume the shape of an innocent person to afflict others? Mather argued that indeed he could. Therefore, spectral evidence alone was insufficient to condemn someone for witchcraft. It is better that 10 suspected witches should escape than that one innocent person should be condemned, he famously declared. This was a powerful statement coming from such an authoritative figure, and it resonated deeply within the intellectual and religious elite of the colony. Other ministers and public figures also began to voice their concerns, albeit cautiously at first. Samuel Willard, a respected Boston minister, openly challenged the court's proceedings. Even some of the judges, like Samuel Sewall, began to experience profound misgivings as the death toll mounted and the justifications grew thinner. Sewall would later publicly repent for his role, a rare act of extraordinary conscience. The sheer logistical and economic strain of the trials also contributed to their eventual collapse. The jails were overcrowded, and the cost of housing and feeding so many prisoners was immense. Moreover, the disruption to daily life, with constant arrests, trials, and executions, began to take its toll on the economy and social stability of the colony. Farmers were jailed, leaving their crops unharvested. Families were torn apart. The constant state of fear paralyzed communities. Perhaps one of the most compelling factors was the growing number of recantations of confessions. Many who had confessed under duress, seeing no other way to escape execution, later bravely recanted their confessions once the immediate threat of execution seemed to wane. These recantations, often public and defiant, exposed the coercive methods used to obtain the confessions and further undermined the credibility of the entire process. If confessions were false, what then of the entire conspiracy theory they were meant to confirm? Governor William Phipps, upon his return to the colony and witnessing the spiraling chaos, also became increasingly concerned. His own wife, Lady Mary Phipps, as mentioned, had been indirectly accused, which likely brought the reality of the situation closer to home for him. While he had initially supported the Court of Oyer and Terminer, the mounting criticism, particularly from Increase Mather and other influential figures, and the sheer irrationality of the continuing accusations, eventually compelled him to act. In October 1692, Governor Phipps issued an order prohibiting further arrests for witchcraft and ordering the Superior Court of Judicature, the colony's regular high court, which replaced the ad hoc Court of Oyer and Terminer, to disallow spectral evidence in any future witchcraft trials. This was the decisive blow. Without spectral evidence, the foundation upon which most of the convictions rested crumbled. The primary engine of the witch hunt was effectively shut down. The Court of Oyer and Terminer was finally dissolved by Governor Phipps in October 1692. The shift marked a crucial turning point. It was an admission, albeit tacit, that the proceedings had gone horribly awry. The shocking truth was that the very zeal that had driven the trials was now being tempered by a growing realization of the devastating injustice being wrought. The terrifying belief in an active satanic conspiracy was not entirely abandoned overnight, but the legal framework that enabled its most destructive manifestations had been dismantled. The long nightmare was, at last, slowly drawing to a close. With Governor Phipps's decisive intervention in October 1692, the frenzied pace of the witch trials abruptly halted. The Court of Oyer and Terminer was dissolved, and the Superior Court of Judicature was established to take over the remaining cases. Crucially, the new court was instructed to no longer accept spectral evidence, effectively removing the primary mechanism by which convictions had been secured. This single directive was the most significant factor in bringing the nightmare to an end. When the Superior Court convened in January 1693, the change was immediate and dramatic. Without the volatile, unprovable testimonies of spectral torment, the vast majority of cases against the remaining accused collapsed. Of the 52 people tried, 49 were acquitted. Only 3 individuals were found guilty, and even for them, Governor Phipps promptly reprieved them, effectively pardoning them and halting any further executions. By May 1693, Governor Phipps issued a general reprieve for all those still imprisoned on witchcraft charges, and by the end of the year, all accused witches were finally released from jail. The legal nightmare was over, but the human cost was immense. By the time the madness subsided, 19 people had been hanged on Gallows Hill. Giles Corey had been pressed to death. At least 5 individuals had died in prison due to the harsh conditions, including Sarah Osborne, as well as a few infants born to imprisoned women. The total number of accused individuals reached approximately 200, with around 150 of those formerly imprisoned. Hundreds more had been accused, examined, and lived under the cloud of suspicion. The communities involved were deeply scarred, their social fabric torn apart by accusations, betrayals, and the loss of innocent lives. The aftermath was not one of immediate repentance or universal understanding. Instead, it was a period of slow, painful reckoning. For many, the belief in witchcraft did not simply vanish overnight. The question became not if witchcraft was real, but how such a terrible mistake could have been made. The theological debate, particularly concerning the validity of spectral evidence, continued for some time. Ministers like Cotton Mather, while acknowledging errors in the legal process, maintained their belief in the reality of witchcraft and the devil's hand in the events. He believed the devil had simply found a new, more cunning way to deceive, perhaps by taking the shape of innocent people. However, a profound sense of regret and guilt began to emerge. The first significant public apology came from Samuel Sewall, one of the judges on the Court of Oyer and Terminer. On January 14, 1697, a day of public fasting and prayer was held throughout the colony to acknowledge the errors of the witch trials. On that day in the Old South Meeting House in Boston, Samuel Sewall stood before the congregation while his minister read out his confession. Samuel Sewall, sensible of the reiterated strokes of God upon himself and family, desires to take the blame and shame of it, asking pardon of men, and especially desiring prayers that God, who has an unlimited authority, would pardon all his sin. This was a remarkably courageous act for a public figure of his standing, a poignant admission of guilt that set an early precedent for official repentance. Over the next few years, others involved in the trials began to express remorse. 12 of the jurors signed a public apology in 1697, admitting they had been sadly deluded and mistaken. In 1706, Anne Putnam Jr., one of the most prominent of the afflicted girls, stood before the Salem village congregation and publicly apologized for her role, expressing sorrow for causing the deaths of innocent people and attributing her actions to the great delusion of Satan. This was a crucial moment, as it came from one of the primary accusers, further eroding the legitimacy of the earlier proceedings. The General Court of Massachusetts eventually took steps towards restitution and exoneration. In 1711, it passed an act that reversed the attainder's convictions for 22 of the victims and ordered monetary compensation to be paid to their families. This was a significant, though belated, acknowledgement of the injustice. However, it was not a full exoneration for all victims, and some families continued to fight for their loved ones' names to be cleared for centuries. It wasn't until 1957 that the Massachusetts legislature formally apologized for the trials, clearing the names of 6 more victims. And it took until 2001 for all remaining accused individuals to be officially exonerated. The impact on Salem Village was profound and long-lasting. The village itself never fully recovered from the internal divisions and the psychological scars. Many families moved away, unable to bear the weight of what had transpired. The community struggled to reconcile its past, and the memory of the trials shaped its identity for generations. The very name Salem became synonymous with fanaticism and injustice. Beyond the immediate communities, the Salem witch trials left a deep imprint on the developing American consciousness. They became a cautionary tale, a stark reminder of the dangers of religious extremism, unchecked fear, and the abuse of legal authority. The experience contributed to a growing skepticism towards claims of supernatural intervention in legal proceedings, and fostered a greater emphasis on rational evidence and due process. Some historians argue that it even indirectly contributed to the later separation of church and state, as people became wary of the dangers of mixing religious zeal with governmental power. The shocking truth about witchcraft in colonial America is not just that it happened, but that it revealed the terrifying fragility of justice and reason when confronted by a pervasive, irrational fear. It stands as a chilling testament to how easily a society, even one founded on principles of liberty and piety, can descend into madness, consuming its own in a desperate hunt for an imagined evil. But the lingering question remains: why did the Salem witch trials escalate to such an unparalleled and devastating degree, eclipsing all previous incidents in colonial America? What made Salem the epicenter of such widespread and deadly hysteria? The answer lies in a confluence of unique factors, a veritable perfect storm of societal, environmental, and political pressures that, when combined, created an explosively volatile atmosphere. The scars of Salem, though invisible, run deep, serving as a perpetual warning from our past. We've explored the intellectual bedrock of witch fear, the precedents of earlier, smaller panics, and the horrific events of 1692. Firstly, the political instability of Massachusetts Bay Colony was a critical underlying factor. As mentioned, the colony's charter had been revoked in 1684 by the English Crown, essentially dissolving its government. For 8 years, the colony existed in a state of political limbo, without a fully legitimate governor or a stable legal system. This period was marked by uncertainty, power struggles, and a general sense of unease. When Governor Phipps finally arrived in May 1692 with a new charter and commission, he found himself stepping into a legal and social vacuum, ill-equipped to handle the burgeoning crisis. The ad hoc nature of the Court of Oyer and Terminer, convened out of necessity rather than established legal process, undoubtedly contributed to its unchecked power and lack of external oversight. Had there been a stable, experienced judicial system in place, the early stages of the panic might have been contained. Secondly, the local tensions within Salem village itself were unusually acute. Unlike other settlements, Salem village was embroiled in a protracted, bitter dispute over its independence from Salem town, and more significantly, a furious factional battle over its minister, Reverend Samuel Parris. The community was deeply divided between those who supported Parris and those who wished to remove him. These were not minor disagreements. They were deep personal animosities that had festered for years. When the initial accusations arose from Parris's own household, it immediately provided a weapon for these pre-existing feuds. Accusations of witchcraft could be, and often were, leveraged against personal enemies, land rivals, or those in the opposing faction regarding Parris. The pre-existing social fractures provided convenient fault lines for the accusations to exploit and widen. Thirdly, the power of the accusers, particularly the young afflicted girls, was unprecedented. Their dramatic fits and unwavering claims of spectral torment were given immense credibility by the magistrates, especially Chief Justice Stoughton. Unlike earlier cases where spectral evidence was sometimes debated or used with caution, in Salem, it became the cornerstone of the prosecution. This decision to fully embrace spectral evidence opened the floodgates. Because the specter could ostensibly torment someone from afar, and because only the afflicted could see it, their testimony became almost unchallengeable. This gave the girls immense, almost terrifying power, and they used it to great effect, often in public performance that swayed opinion. Fourthly, the rapid spread of accusations beyond the usual marginalized targets was a crucial differentiator. In previous panics, accusations tended to stay focused on outcasts, the elderly, or those already suspected of maleficium. In Salem, while the initial targets fit this mold, Tituba, Sarah Good, Sarah Osborne, the accusations quickly expanded to include respected, pious members of the community like Rebecca Nurse, Martha Corey, and even a former minister, George Burroughs. This expansion meant that a wider cross-section of society became involved, either as accusers, accused, or concerned bystanders, escalating the panic's reach and severity. When even the seemingly innocent could be witches, the very fabric of trust within communities began to fray. Fifthly, the war with Native Americans and the constant threat on the frontier played a significant, if often overlooked, role. King William's War, part of the larger Anglo-French conflict, was raging, and the Massachusetts frontier was under constant threat of attack from French-allied Native American tribes. Many refugees from these frontier settlements, having witnessed unspeakable horrors, poured into the relatively safer interior towns like Salem. These individuals, including some of the key afflicted girls like Mercy Lewis and Ann Putnam Jr., had experienced profound trauma and loss. Their experiences may have heightened their susceptibility to fits and their readiness to attribute suffering to malevolent, unseen forces. The devil was seen as allied with the savage, Indians, making the internal threat of witchcraft seem even more plausible and terrifying as a spiritual extension of the physical war. Finally, the deep-seated theological beliefs of the Puritans, while always present, reached a fever pitch in 1692. Many believed they were living in the last days before Christ's return, and that Satan would make a final, desperate attempt to undermine God's kingdom. The New World was viewed as a battleground, and the success of their city upon a hill was seen as a direct challenge to the devil. In this apocalyptic worldview, the sudden outbreak of afflictions and witchcraft was interpreted as a direct, undeniable sign of Satan's active and widespread conspiracy to destroy their godly experiment. This provided a powerful, almost irresistible, religious imperative for the magistrates and ministers to vigorously pursue and eradicate the perceived evil. The perceived stakes were not just human lives, but the very soul of the colony and its divine mission. The combination of a fractured political system, intense local discord, the unchecked power of accusers, the indiscriminate expansion of accusations, the trauma of frontier warfare, and a heightened apocalyptic religious fervor created a unique crucible in Salem. It was this perfect storm of factors that transformed a localized fear into a devastating, colony-wide crisis, making Salem a name synonymous with mass delusion and injustice. A chilling testament to how easily a society can lose its bearings when gripped by fear and convinced of an unseen enemy's pervasive reach. The shocking truth is that Salem was not simply a tragic mistake, but the horrifying consequence of multiple compounding pressures that converged at one fatal moment. At the very heart of the Salem witch trials were the afflicted individuals, predominantly young women and girls, whose dramatic fits and claims of torment by unseen specters provided the most compelling and ultimately destructive evidence for the court. Their experiences were central to the panic, but the nature of their afflictions and their motivations remains one of the most debated and enigmatic aspects of the entire episode. Were they genuine victims of some unknown ailment, manipulative fraudsters seeking attention, or something else entirely? The shocking truth is that there's no single, simple answer, and the reality was likely a complex blend of factors. Let's first consider the possibility of genuine physiological or psychological conditions. In a time before modern medicine and psychology, unusual behaviors were readily attributed to supernatural causes. Historians and scientists have proposed various medical explanations for the symptoms exhibited by the afflicted girls. Ergot poisoning. One prominent theory suggests that the girls consumed rye contaminated with claviceps purpurea, a fungus that causes ergotism. Symptoms of ergot poisoning can include convulsions, hallucinations, muscle spasms, and a creeping or crawling sensation on the skin, eerily similar to the descriptions of being pinched or pricked by specters. This theory, first proposed in the 1970s, points to the damp, cool conditions conducive to mold growth and the reliance on rye as a staple grain in Salem Village. Encephalitis or other neurological disorders. Certain brain inflammations or neurological conditions could manifest as seizures, tics, altered consciousness, and behavioral changes, which might have been misinterpreted as demonic possession. Stress and psychological trauma. The intense pressures of Puritan life, strict religious upbringing, limited social outlets for young women, and the pervasive fear of the devil could have led to mass psychogenic illness or mass hysteria. The girls lived in a highly restrictive society where emotional expression was often suppressed. The ongoing frontier war, with its inherent dangers and the influx of traumatized refugees into Salem, added another layer of collective anxiety. The fits could have been a subconscious coping mechanism for extreme stress or a form of conversion disorder. The girls themselves, initially at least, may have genuinely believed they were tormented. In a society that taught them to interpret all misfortune through a spiritual lens, their inexplicable symptoms would naturally be attributed to the devil. Once this belief took hold, suggestion and group dynamics could easily amplify the symptoms, creating a self-reinforcing cycle. However, it is equally difficult to ignore the element of deliberate manipulation or fraud. As the trials progressed, the power and influence wielded by the afflicted became undeniable. They held the lives of their neighbors in their hands. The attention, the validation, and the sheer control they exercised must have been intoxicating for young women who otherwise had very little agency in their society. Desire for attention. In a strict Puritan society where children were seen and not heard, the girls suddenly became the center of public attention, their every utterance taken with gravitas. This sudden elevation in status could have been a powerful motivator. Personal grudges. Several of the afflicted had personal animosities with the accused or their families. Ann Putnam Jr., for instance, came from a family with deep-seated grievances against the nurses and porters, and she was responsible for accusing many individuals tied to her family's rivals. The accusations could have been a way to settle scores or gain an advantage in land disputes or church politics. Fear of being accused themselves. Once the panic gained momentum, there was a real danger that those who seemed to recover from their fits, or those who expressed skepticism, might themselves be accused. Maintaining the performance and even escalating it could have been a desperate strategy for self-preservation. Mimicry and group dynamics. As more girls joined the ranks of the afflicted, they likely influenced each other. Observing the reactions and accusations of others could have led to conscious or subconscious mimicry, and the dramatic nature of the fits could have escalated as each girl tried to prove her own suffering and credibility. Consider the case of Tituba's confession. Whether coerced or a desperate act of self-preservation, her vivid storytelling provided a narrative template. Other afflicted individuals might have unconsciously or consciously adopted elements of this narrative, adding their own details to make their experiences seem more authentic and terrifying. Furthermore, the lines between genuine affliction, psychological manifestation, and conscious deception likely blurred over time. What might have started as a real, inexplicable symptom could have evolved into a deliberate performance as the girls learned the power they held. The psychological pressure on them to continue performing, to continue naming names, must have been immense. They were lauded as instruments of God, chosen to uncover the devil's conspiracy. To back down would have been to admit to fraud, or worse, to be seen as a witch themselves. The shocking truth about the afflicted is that they were not simply villains or victims, but deeply complex figures operating within an extraordinary historical crucible. Their experiences were a reflection of the intense religious beliefs, social anxieties, and scientific ignorance of their time. They were, in a sense, a symptom of the wider societal pathology. While we can speculate about the precise nature of their afflictions, their roles as central catalysts for one of America's darkest chapters remain undisputed. Their cries, whether genuine or performed, condemned innocent lives and exposed the terrifying vulnerability of a society convinced it was fighting the devil himself. The true tragedy of the Salem witch trials lies, of course, with the accused. These were not, by and large, individuals who actively practiced malefic magic or worshipped the devil in the traditional sense. Instead, they were ordinary men, women, and even children, caught in an extraordinary maelstrom of fear, suspicion, and injustice. The shocking truth is that the demographic profile of the accused in Salem defied some of the conventional patterns of European witch hunts, revealing a deeper, more pervasive societal breakdown. Initially, as we discussed, the accused fit a somewhat predictable pattern: marginalized women like Sarah Good and Sarah Osborne, or the enslaved Tituba. These were individuals on the fringes of society, often poor, elderly, or seen as eccentric, making them easy targets for suspicion when misfortune struck. They had little social capital or powerful connections to defend themselves. However, as the panic escalated, the accusations began to cast an increasingly wide net, ensnaring individuals who were far from marginalized. This is where Salem significantly deviated from many European witch hunts. The pious and respected. The accusations against Rebecca Nurse and Martha Corey, both respected, church-going women of good standing, were deeply unsettling to the community. Their piety and good reputation offered no protection. This demonstrated that the criteria for accusation had moved beyond mere social deviance. Men. While European witch hunts disproportionately targeted women, Salem saw a significant number of men accused and executed. Reverend George Burroughs, John Proctor, Giles Corey, and John Willard are prominent examples. This suggests that the fear in Salem was less about traditional misogynistic views of female magic, and more about a perceived widespread, indiscriminate conspiracy orchestrated by the devil himself, targeting anyone. Children, even children, were not immune. Dorcas Good, the 4-year-old daughter of Sarah Good, was imprisoned, endured harsh conditions, and reportedly showed signs of mental distress for the rest of her life. Other young children were accused as well, highlighting the indiscriminate nature of the panic. The skeptics, crucially, many of the accused were individuals who had voiced skepticism about the trials, the validity of spectral evidence, or the integrity of the afflicted girls. John Proctor, a vocal critic, was accused shortly after he openly questioned the proceedings. John Willard, a constable, was accused after he refused to make further arrests, having grown disillusioned with the process. Their skepticism was interpreted as a sign of their own guilt, as only those in league with the devil would dare to question his exposure. The wealthy and influential. As the panic reached its peak, even some of the colony's wealthiest and most politically connected families saw their members accused. This further eroded public trust and contributed to the eventual turning of the tide. The accusation of Lady Mary Phipps, wife of the governor, was a stark example of how far the accusations had strayed from the original profile of the accused. What united many of these diverse individuals, regardless of their social standing, was often their direct or indirect connection to existing community disputes. Salem Village was, as noted, deeply factionalized. Those who sided against Reverend Parris, those involved in land disputes, or those with long-standing personal grievances often found themselves or their allies among the accused. The witchcraft accusations became a perverse tool for settling old scores, albeit with deadly consequences. The experiences of the accused were harrowing. Upon accusation, they faced immediate arrest and public examination. These examinations were not designed to be fair hearings, but rather inquisitions aimed at eliciting a confession. The accused were often subjected to intense interrogation, sometimes for hours on end, by magistrates who firmly believed in their guilt. They were rarely afforded legal counsel. The conditions in prison were horrific. Jails were often overcrowded, unsanitary, and freezing, especially during the cold New England winter. Accused individuals were often shackled to prevent their specters from escaping or tormenting others. Many suffered from malnutrition and disease. As we know, several died while incarcerated, never even reaching trial, their lives ended by the brutal conditions of their confinement. The psychological torment must have been immense. To be accused of the gravest crime imaginable, a pact with the devil by your neighbors, your friends, even your own family members, as some children like Mary Lacey Jr. accused their parents, was a profound betrayal. To be subjected to public humiliation, to have your body searched for devil's marks, and to witness the dramatic performances of the afflicted, all while knowing you were innocent, must have been soul-crushing. The agonizing choice presented to the accused, confess and live, with a ruined reputation and forced ostracization, or deny and face almost certain death, further highlights the injustice. For many, maintaining their innocence was a matter of spiritual integrity, a refusal to lie about their relationship with God, even if it meant sacrificing their earthly lives. Their defiance, like that of Bridget Bishop or John Proctor, was often misconstrued by the court as further proof of their guilt, a sign of the devil empowering them to resist justice. The cases of the accused reveal a chilling panorama of human vulnerability in the face of collective delusion. They were scapegoats for societal anxieties, victims of a flawed legal system, and pawns in a terrifying religious narrative. Their stories serve as a powerful reminder of how quickly justice can be perverted when fear overshadows reason, and how easily individuals, regardless of their standing, can be swept away by the tide of a moral panic. The shocking truth is that the accused were not the monsters of Puritan nightmares, but the innocent casualties of a society that lost its way. In the chaotic maelstrom of the Salem witch trials, the roles played by the colonial authorities, the magistrates, judges, and ministers, are perhaps the most complex and ethically fraught. They were the ones who held the reins of power, who interpreted the law, and who ultimately delivered the verdicts that led to so many deaths. The question inevitably arises: were they earnest, albeit tragically misguided, believers doing what they thought was God's work, or were they coercive forces, actively manipulating the process for their own ends? The shocking truth is that, overwhelmingly, they were deeply committed believers, a fact that makes the tragedy even more poignant and disturbing. Leading the charge was Chief Justice William Stoughton. Stoughton was a formidable figure, a Harvard graduate, and a devout Puritan who had also studied theology. He was fiercely intelligent, but also rigid in his beliefs and unwavering in his conviction that the devil was actively at work in New England. For Stoughton, the trials were not just legal proceedings. They were a holy crusade, a spiritual battle against the forces of evil attempting to undermine God's chosen society. His theological conviction meant he wholeheartedly accepted spectral evidence, viewing it as a divinely sanctioned means of revealing the devil's hidden agents. He believed that God would not allow the devil to afflict innocent people through the specter of a godly individual. His unyielding stance, particularly in rejecting arguments against spectral evidence, was perhaps the single most critical factor in the high number of convictions and executions. He genuinely believed he was doing God's will. The local magistrates, such as Jonathan Corwin and John Hathorne, who conducted the initial examinations, shared Stoughton's worldview. They were respectable community leaders, but they lacked formal legal training and were deeply ingrained in the Puritan belief system. Their examinations were less about impartial investigation and more about eliciting confessions and confirming the accuser's claims. They interpreted any denial as further evidence of the devil's hold, and any strange physical reaction from the accused as proof of their evil power. They pressed the accused relentlessly, using leading questions and often ignoring inconsistencies in the accusations. They were not malicious in the modern sense, but they were deeply biased by their fervent beliefs and the prevailing panic. The ministers also played a pivotal, and often contradictory, role. They were the intellectual and spiritual guides of the community, and their sermons constantly reinforced the reality of the devil's power and the necessity of rooting out witchcraft. Reverend Samuel Parris, the embattled minister of Salem Village, was at the epicenter of the initial outbreak. His own household was the source of the first accusations, and his fervent belief in the devil's conspiracy undoubtedly influenced his congregation and the afflicted girls. His personal grievances within the village may have subconsciously, or even consciously, led him to accept accusations against his opponents. Cotton Mather, arguably the most influential minister in New England at the time, was a prolific writer on demonology and a strong advocate for prosecuting witches. He corresponded with the judges, providing theological justification for the trials. While he later expressed some caution about the methods of obtaining evidence, particularly the reliability of spectral evidence in isolation, he never doubted the existence of the witches or the justness of the overall cause. His intellectual weight lent immense credibility to the proceedings. Increase Mather, Cotton Mather's father and the president of Harvard, eventually became a crucial voice against the over-reliance on spectral evidence. His treatise Cases of Conscience concerning evil spirits personating men ultimately provided the intellectual and theological justification for Governor Phipps to end the use of spectral evidence, marking a critical turning point. His intervention, while late, was instrumental. It's important to recognize that these authorities were operating within a framework of knowledge and belief that was entirely different from our own. For them, the devil was a literal entity, witchcraft a capital crime defined by both biblical injunction and English law. They genuinely believed they were protecting their community and their souls from ultimate evil. This belief, combined with the visible and dramatic afflictions of the accusers, created a powerful confirmation bias. Every new accusation, every dramatic fit, every coerced confession seemed to validate their initial premises. However, their earnest belief did not absolve them of responsibility for the egregious miscarriage of justice. Their failure to apply basic principles of due process, their acceptance of inherently unreliable evidence, their susceptibility to crowd hysteria, and their active encouragement of confessions through duress, all contributed directly to the tragic outcome. The legal and theological standards they applied, while consistent with some contemporary European practices, were ultimately devastating in the context of the Salem Panic. The shocking truth about the authorities is not that they were necessarily cruel or malevolent individuals, but that their profound religious conviction, coupled with a lack of legal sophistication and an overwhelming societal fear, blinded them to the injustices unfolding before their very eyes. They were caught in the very web of delusion they sought to untangle, becoming, in their earnest pursuit of righteousness, instruments of terrible destruction. The lesson from Salem is not just about the dangers of false accusations, but also about the perils of unchecked authority, even when wielded by those who believe they are acting for the greater good. The road to hell, as the saying goes, is often paved with good intentions. The Salem witch trials, while a specific historical event, have resonated far beyond their time, becoming a powerful symbol and a subject of continuous reinterpretation. Understanding the shocking truth about them requires looking beyond the immediate narrative of fits and accusations to explore the deeper historical, sociological, and psychological currents that historians and scholars have identified as contributing factors. It's a complex tapestry woven from cultural anxieties, gender roles, economic shifts, and even ecological influences. One significant lens through which historians view the trials is socioeconomic conflict. As previously mentioned, Salem Village was a community deeply fractured by internal disputes. These often pitted the poorer, more agrarian faction, largely residing in the western part of the village and more traditional in their Puritan beliefs, against the more commercially oriented, increasingly prosperous eastern faction, closer to Salem town. Many of the accusers, particularly the afflicted girls and their families, like the Putnams, belonged to the western, more conservative and often less affluent faction. Many of the accused, especially as the trials progressed, were from the eastern, more commercially successful families. This theory suggests that the accusations were, at least in part, a subconscious or even conscious expression of resentment and tension between these two emerging classes or factions within the community. The fear of witchcraft provided a convenient, divinely sanctioned outlet for these earthly grievances. Another powerful interpretive framework centers on gender roles and misogyny. While men were accused and executed in Salem, the vast majority of those accused, especially in the initial stages, were women. Many of these women were marginalized, elderly, poor, childless, or economically independent widows, individuals who deviated from the prescribed norms of female subservience and domesticity in Puritan society. A woman who was outspoken, argumentative, or simply unconventional could easily be seen as unruly, and thus susceptible to the devil's influence. Witchcraft accusations, in this view, served as a powerful mechanism of social control, policing female behavior and reinforcing patriarchal norms. The inherent misogynistic undercurrents of the era provided a fertile ground for such accusations to flourish against women who, for various reasons, challenged or simply did not fit neatly into societal expectations. The role of trauma and psychological stress is also a significant interpretation. Many of the afflicted girls had lived through or witnessed the horrors of King William's War on the frontier, experiencing profound loss and violence. They were refugees, displaced from their homes, and often suffering from what we might today recognize as PTSD. This collective trauma, combined with the extreme pressures of a rigid Puritan society and the constant fear of the devil, could have manifested in mass psychogenic illness. The fits, the visions, the accusations, they could be seen as a desperate, subconscious coping mechanism for overwhelming anxiety and grief, expressed through the only available cultural framework: witchcraft. Furthermore, some interpretations delve into the ecological and environmental factors. The ergot poisoning theory, while debated, highlights how environmental conditions, like a damp spring leading to contaminated rye crops, could have produced physiological symptoms that were then interpreted as supernatural. While not the sole cause, such factors could have contributed to the initial, seemingly genuine, afflictions, thereby sparking the cascade of accusations. The political vacuum following the revocation of the Massachusetts Bay Charter has also been emphasized. The lack of a stable, legitimate government and judicial system meant that when the panic erupted, there was no strong, central authority to contain it effectively. The creation of the Court of Oyer and Terminer, an ad hoc body, lacked the checks and balances of a well-established legal system, allowing the panic to spiral unchecked for months. This institutional weakness was crucial in allowing the hysteria to reach its tragic peak. Finally, the deeply ingrained Puritan worldview, with its emphasis on an active, cunning devil and a society constantly under spiritual siege, remains paramount in all interpretations. Regardless of other contributing factors, the trials cannot be understood without acknowledging the profound religious convictions of the colonists. They truly believed they were fighting a cosmic battle, and the outbreak of witchcraft was seen as undeniable proof of Satan's desperate attempt to destroy their godly experiment. This zealous belief, though tragically misguided in its application, provided the ultimate justification for the extreme measures taken. The shocking truth about witchcraft in colonial America, viewed through these various lenses, is that it was not merely a simple case of mass delusion. It was a complex, multi-layered tragedy born of a society under immense stress. Economic anxieties, social divisions, patriarchal structures, unresolved trauma, political instability, and an unyielding religious worldview all converged in Salem. The trials serve as a chilling historical laboratory, demonstrating how easily a community, under extraordinary pressure, can turn on itself, finding scapegoats for its deepest fears and anxieties, and how devastating the consequences can be when rational thought is abandoned in the fervent pursuit of an imagined evil. It stands as a timeless warning of the dangers of moral panics and the fragility of justice in the face of collective hysteria. The immediate aftermath of the Salem witch trials was a period of slow, painful healing and cautious introspection. But the shadow of Salem, far from fading, has lengthened across the centuries, becoming an indelible part of the American consciousness. Its legacy is complex, permeating our understanding of justice, civil liberties, and the dangers of mass hysteria. The shocking truth is that Salem isn't just a historical footnote. It's a living cautionary tale that continues to shape our cultural, legal, and political discourse. Perhaps the most direct and tangible legacy of Salem lies in its influence on American legal thought and due process. The egregious miscarriages of justice, particularly the reliance on spectral evidence and coerced confessions, served as a powerful negative example, While it took time, the lessons learned from Salem contributed to a growing skepticism towards subjective testimony and a greater emphasis on tangible, verifiable evidence in courtrooms. The trials highlighted the critical importance of legal representation, the presumption of innocence, and the protection against self-incrimination, principles that would eventually become cornerstones of the American legal system and are enshrined in the Bill of Rights. The concept of innocent until proven guilty gained greater weight in the public and legal consciousness in the wake of such a spectacular failure of justice. Beyond the courtroom, Salem stands as a profound warning against the dangers of religious extremism and the fusion of church and state. The trials vividly demonstrated what can happen when religious fervor overrides reason, and when governmental authority is wielded in the name of a singular, unquestioned theological doctrine. For many, the horrors of Salem reinforce the idea that civil authority should not be dictated by religious dogma, laying some of the groundwork for the later constitutional principle of the separation of church and state. The desire to prevent another, Salem, fueled arguments for religious tolerance and individual liberty of conscience. Culturally, Salem has become an enduring metaphor for mass hysteria, moral panic, and witch hunts. Whenever a society descends into irrational fear, begins to persecute an unpopular minority, or lashes out with unfounded accusations, the term witch hunt is invoked. From the McCarthy era's anti-communist paranoia in the 1950s to modern-day political rhetoric, the imagery of Salem is readily deployed to criticize perceived injustices, overzealous investigations, and the persecution of individuals based on flimsy evidence or popular prejudice. The story of Salem acts as a constant reminder that such irrational periods are not confined to the past, but can re-emerge in different guises. The trials also profoundly impacted the Puritan self-perception. The city upon a hill ideal, a vision of a godly society blessed by God, was shattered by the events of 1692. The tragedy forced a painful introspection within Puritan communities, leading to questions about their own righteousness and whether they had somehow failed God. This period of self-doubt contributed to a gradual shift away from the strict, rigid Puritanism that had defined early New England, paving the way for a more moderate and diverse religious landscape. In literature and popular culture, Salem holds an almost mythical status. Nathaniel Hawthorne, a descendant of Judge John Hathorne, wrestled with his family's dark legacy in works like The Scarlet Letter and The House of the Seven Gables, exploring themes of guilt, sin, and the lasting impact of historical injustices. Arthur Miller's seminal play The Crucible, written in 1953 as an allegory for McCarthyism, cemented Salem's place in the modern imagination, brilliantly illustrating how fear and ideology can warp truth and destroy lives. This play, taught in schools across America, ensures that the lessons of Salem continue to be debated and understood by new generations. Even today, in the town of Salem, Massachusetts, the legacy is palpable. While it has embraced its history, albeit with a degree of ambivalence, the various memorials, museums, and historical sites serve as tangible reminders of the events of 1692. They ensure that the victims are remembered and the lessons are not forgotten. The long and winding path to official exoneration for the victims also speaks volumes about this enduring legacy. As we noted, it took centuries for the Massachusetts legislature to fully clear the names of all those unjustly condemned, a testament to how deeply ingrained the societal fear was and how slowly historical wounds can heal. The shocking truth about Salem's legacy is that it serves as a perpetual warning, not just about the specific dangers of witchcraft beliefs, but about the timeless human propensity for fear, scapegoating, and the devastating consequences when due process is abandoned. It reminds us that truth, can be easily manipulated when panic reigns, and that eternal vigilance is required to safeguard justice and liberty. It is a mirror reflecting the darkest aspects of our collective human nature, urging us to question authority, uphold reason, and always remember the innocent lives lost when societies lose their way. The official end of the Salem witch trials in early 1693 marked not merely the cessation of hangings and imprisonments, but the quiet, agonizing beginning of a societal shift. It was the end of a specific era of widespread, state-sanctioned witch hunting in colonial America, and the gradual birth of a new awareness regarding the limits of credulity and the necessity of due process. The shocking truth is that this turning point wasn't a sudden epiphany, but a slow, painful awakening that had profound implications for the nascent American character. The initial reactions to the cessation of the trials were mixed. While relief surely washed over many, particularly those still imprisoned or those with accused loved ones, there was no immediate, universal condemnation of the entire process. As we've seen, prominent figures like Cotton Mather continued to believe in the reality of witchcraft, merely suggesting that the methods used to detect it had been flawed, allowing the devil to deceive the court. This intellectual discomfort, the need to reconcile strong religious belief with undeniable human error, speaks to the depth of the challenge. However, the sheer scale of the tragedy and the undeniable innocence of many victims ultimately could not be ignored. The sight of esteemed citizens being condemned on spectral testimony, the defiant innocence maintained by figures like Rebecca Nurse and John Proctor even on the gallows, and the eventual recantations of those who had confessed under duress, chipped away at the certainty that had fueled the panic. The sheer illogicality of the accusations, particularly when they started to target highly respected individuals, eventually became too glaring to overlook. The role of Governor William Phipps in ending the trials, influenced by the reasoned arguments of Increase Mather and the mounting chaos, was pivotal. His decision to disallow spectral evidence was a critical legal pivot point. This single act, more than any other, dismantled the primary engine of the convictions. It forced the court to rely on tangible, provable facts, which were simply absent in the vast majority of the witchcraft cases. The immediate and dramatic reduction in convictions once spectral evidence was excluded offered irrefutable proof of its unreliability. This period of post-trial reflection fostered a gradual but significant shift in how legal authorities and even the general public viewed evidence. While the belief in witchcraft didn't vanish overnight, the readiness to convict based on subjective, unprovable claims drastically diminished. The legal precedent set by Salem, particularly the discrediting of spectral evidence, would largely prevent similar large-scale witch hunts from ever occurring again in America. The lesson was etched into the collective memory. While the devil might be real, human judgment could be fallible, and the legal system must err on the side of caution and tangible proof. The 1697 public day of fasting and repentance, and particularly Samuel Sewall's courageous public apology, served as a symbolic moment of collective reckoning. It was an acknowledgement that a grave injustice had occurred, a public penance for societal and judicial error. While it did not immediately erase the pain or fully repair the damage, it initiated a process of official and moral introspection that would continue for centuries. This historical moment, therefore, marks the decline of the witch craze as a dominant cultural and legal phenomenon in colonial America. The Enlightenment ideals, which emphasized reason, scientific inquiry, and individual rights, were slowly beginning to filter into colonial thought. While Puritanism remained a powerful force, the unbridled religious zeal that had fueled the trials began to temper. There was a growing emphasis on good works and a slightly less rigid interpretation of divine providence, allowing for greater human agency and responsibility, rather than attributing all misfortune solely to the devil's direct intervention. The enduring impact of Salem lies not just in its dramatic story, but in the profound lessons it imparted. It taught nascent America about the fragility of justice in the face of fear. It underscored the importance of critical thinking, even when confronting the seemingly inexplicable. It highlighted the dangers of social conformity and the courage required to challenge popular opinion or perceived authority. It revealed how easily the search for truth can devolve into the persecution of the innocent when rationality is abandoned. The shocking truth is that the end of the Salem witch trials wasn't simply the end of a dark chapter. It was a painful but necessary birth pang for a society learning to distinguish between spiritual belief and legal fact, between fear and justice. It was a crucible in which fundamental American values of due process, skepticism of unchecked power, and the protection of individual liberties were forged, forever informed by the chilling memory of what happened when those values were tragically abandoned. The shadows of Salem remain, not as a curse, but as a perpetual warning, urging constant vigilance against the forces of irrationality and injustice in all their guises. As we conclude our journey through the chilling events of the Salem witch trials, the most profound and perhaps most shocking truth is not confined to the distant past. The lessons of 1692 are not merely historical curiosities. They are deeply relevant and resonate powerfully in our contemporary world. The phenomenon of the witch hunt, tragically exemplified by Salem, is not a relic of a superstitious age. It is an ever-present danger, a recurring pattern of human behavior that manifests in different forms across time and culture. The first and perhaps most critical lesson is the peril of unchecked fear. Salem demonstrated, in the most brutal fashion, how collective fear, when inflamed by anxiety and amplified by authority figures, can overwhelm reason and dismantle the very foundations of justice. In a climate of pervasive fear, rational thought is often discarded, and the desire for a simple explanation, a tangible scapegoat, becomes overwhelming. Whether the fear is of the devil, a political ideology, a foreign enemy, or a social other, the dynamics of a witch hunt remain remarkably consistent. Identify an enemy, demonize them, suspend normal legal and moral safeguards, and pursue them with unrelenting zeal. Secondly, Salem stands as a stark warning about the dangers of conformity and the suppression of dissent. In 1692, those who dared to question the accusations, to voice skepticism about the spectral evidence, or to defend the accused, often found themselves targeted next. John Proctor, Martha Corey, and John Willard are grim examples. The pressure to conform, to believe what the majority or the authorities believe, can be immense. The courage to stand against the tide, to defend the unpopular truth, is a vital bulwark against injustice. Societies that stifle dissent and punish skepticism create environments ripe for such irrational episodes. Thirdly, the trials underscore the enduring importance of due process and reliable evidence. The willingness of the court of Oyer and Terminer to accept subjective, unverifiable spectral evidence was the fatal flaw that allowed the panic to spiral out of control. This serves as a timeless reminder of why legal systems must insist on tangible, corroborating evidence and must protect the rights of the accused, including the presumption of innocence and the right to a fair defense. Without these safeguards, any accusation, no matter how outlandish, can become a conviction, and any legal system, no matter how well-intentioned, can become an instrument of tyranny. Fourthly, Salem illuminates the destructive power of scapegoating. When a community faces real pressures, economic hardship, disease, social discord, or external threats, it is often easier to attribute these complex problems to a single, easily identifiable evil, agent rather than confronting the underlying issues. The witch becomes a convenient vessel for collective anxieties and frustrations. This pattern of finding an other to blame for societal ills continues to manifest in various forms today, from political polarization to discrimination against minority groups. Finally, the Salem witch trials challenge us to reflect on our own capacity for self-deception and collective delusion. It's easy, in hindsight, to view the people of 1692 as unsophisticated or primitive. But they were intelligent, devout individuals acting on what they believed was a genuine threat. Their story compels us to ask, what are the unquestioned beliefs in our own society? What spectral evidence might we be accepting in our own time, blinded by our own fears, biases, or dominant narratives? The capacity for human error, for moral panic, and for the fervent pursuit of an imagined enemy resides in all of us. The legacy of Salem is not merely a historical artifact to be studied and then filed away. It is a dynamic, living lesson, a constant echo across the centuries, whispering warnings. Every time we see public figures demonized without evidence, every time we witness a rush to judgment based on rumor or hysteria, every time we see a minority group blamed for complex societal problems, the shadow of Salem falls upon us once more. The shocking truth about witchcraft in colonial America is that its story is unfinished. It continues every time we are confronted with the choice between fear and reason, between accusation and justice, between conformity and conscience. The victims of 1692 may be long gone, but their silent plea for truth and justice reverberates through time, urging us to remain vigilant, to question, and to remember that the greatest dangers often lie not in unseen forces, but in the unchecked power of our own fears. May the lessons of Salem forever guide us toward a more reasoned, just, and compassionate future.